In the 1950s, Britain built more than half of every car exported anywhere on Earth. The factories in Coventry, Birmingham, and Oxford were turning out Jaguars, Land Rovers, Minis, and MGs faster than almost any country could match. Only America produced more. The Jaguar E-Type was called the most beautiful car ever made. The original Mini put an entire nation on wheels for the price of a decent suit. If you wanted a car that could survive anything from a Scottish moor to the Sahara, you bought a Land Rover built in Solihull. But today, every single one of those marquees belongs to someone else. Jaguar and Land Rover are owned by Tata Motors of India. Mini and Rolls-Royce belong to BMW in Munich. Bentley sits inside the Volkswagen empire. MG is Chinese. Britain, the country that once dominated world motoring, now ranks below Thailand in global car production. So how did a nation go from building half the world's exported cars to watching its last independent volume manufacturer collapse with vehicles still frozen on the assembly line? It was 1945, and the aircraft factories that had spent 6 years building Spitfires and Lancaster bombers across the English Midlands were suddenly quiet. The war was over, and Britain needed to do something with all that industrial capacity. The answer was cars. The government in Westminster struck a deal with manufacturers. You could have access to rationed steel, but only if you exported at least 75% of everything you built. With Germany's automotive plants in rubble and Japan's industrial base shattered, nobody else was in a position to compete. By 1950, British car exports accounted for 52% of the entire global market. Coventry became known as the Motor City of the United Kingdom, and wages in the region ran 24% above the national average. Morris Miners and Austin Healey's were rolling off ships in New York and Sydney. Americans who had never considered a foreign car suddenly fell in love with something small, nimble, and unmistakably British. The love affair ran deep enough that some historians credit it with opening the door for European bands like the Beatles to conquer American culture a decade later. What could possibly go wrong? However, that dominance rested on a foundation that was already cracking. The Continental car factories were rebuilding with brand new equipment and modern layouts. American production was catching up to American demand. British manufacturers, for all their craftsmanship, had a stubborn resistance to the kind of mass production efficiency that Henry Ford had pioneered decades earlier at the River Rouge plant in Detroit. They preferred small batches, hand-finished details, and wide model ranges that spread their resources thin across dozens of separate workshops. It looked like excellence from the outside. It was actually vulnerability. By 1956, German car production had overtaken Britain's output. Within a decade, the country that had once led the world was scrambling to keep up with Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and Opel. The British government's solution was a merger. If one company could not compete with Volkswagen, then maybe 6 companies shoved into a single corporate structure could. In 1968, Austin, Morris, Jaguar, Rover, Triumph, and MG were merged into British Leyland, the 4th largest car manufacturer in Europe. On paper, it looked like a national champion. However, it was a corporate disaster waiting to happen. What did this mega merger actually produce? British Leyland had too many brands building too many overlapping models in too many outdated factories scattered across the Midlands. The Austin Allegro was supposed to be the family car that would take on the Volkswagen Golf. Instead, it became a byword for everything wrong with British manufacturing. Rear windows popped out if you jacked the car up in the wrong place. Wheels worked themselves loose on the motorway. The Quartic steering wheel, shaped like a flattened rectangle, baffled everyone who sat behind it. How bad did it get? The Allegro was eventually banned from the Blackwall Tunnel in London because its shell bent so badly under towing that the back windscreen would shatter. In a 2008 poll, it was voted the worst British car ever made. Nearly 600,000 Allegros were built, but by the time of that poll, Only about 180 remained on the road. The Morris Marina was not much better. British Leyland chairman Lord Donald Stokes insisted on reusing seats from the Austin Maxi and trim from other models to save money, and it showed in every panel gap. The Marina handled poorly, the interior trim felt cheap, and the overall impression was of a car designed by committee under budget pressure. These were the vehicles Britain was sending into showrooms in Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Los Angeles to compete against the Toyota Corolla and the Volkswagen Beetle. What did overseas buyers think when they compared the two? They bought the imports. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because it was not just the cars that were falling apart. Between 1978 and 1979, the Longbridge plant in Birmingham recorded 523 walkouts in 30 months. Some were over serious grievances. A worker had drowned in a paint bath. Safety conditions in parts of the factory were genuinely dangerous, but others defied any rational explanation. Workers walked out over a demand for the company to supply them with Marks & Spencer underwear. Another stoppage happened when someone tried to repair a typewriter. One walkout was triggered by the discovery of a dead cat on the factory floor. Derek Robinson, the union convener at Longbridge, became the public face of the chaos. The tabloids called him Red Robbo, a reference to his membership in the Communist Party of Great Britain. The reality, though, was more complicated than the Fleet Street headlines suggested. Robinson was often called into the Longbridge factory at 2 and 3 in the morning to negotiate an end to wildcat walkouts he had not started. The filmmaker Ken Loach argued that Robinson spent more time trying to prevent strikes than causing them. Perception, though, became the accepted version of history, and the image of militant shop stewards holding the British car industry hostage stuck in the national consciousness for decades. So who was really to blame? Meanwhile, the quality of British Leyland's cars continued to deteriorate in the Midlands workshops. The customers who could afford alternatives were already buying Hondas and Toyotas. What happened next would cost British taxpayers more than £1 billion. In 1975, British Leyland went bankrupt. The government nationalized the company because the alternative, letting a manufacturer that employed nearly 200,000 workers simply vanish, was politically unthinkable. Cars, unlike steel mills or coal mines, carried a sense of national prestige. Letting the car industry fail felt like admitting that Britain itself was failing. Over the next 7 years, the British taxpayer poured more than £1.4 billion into keeping the company alive. It was too big to fail, yet too broken to fix. Michael Edwards arrived as managing director in 1977 with a mandate to restructure everything from the boardroom to the factory floor. He fired Derek Robinson in November 1979 for co-authoring a pamphlet that criticized British Leyland management. The ensuing sympathy strike ballot at Longbridge failed spectacularly, with 14,000 workers voting against and only 600 voting in favor. Robinson's era was over. However, the damage to British Leyland's reputation and to the broader idea that Britain could build a car you could trust had already taken hold across every export market. What followed was a long, slow dismantling that played out across boardrooms in London, Tokyo, and Munich over the course of 2 decades. British Leyland became the Rover Group and was sold to British Aerospace in 1988. Margaret Thatcher's government, which had no appetite for pouring more public money into car manufacturing, was happy to see it leave the public books. Rover then entered a collaboration with Honda of Japan, and for a brief period in the late 80s and early 90s, this partnership actually produced some decent cars. The Rover 800 was built alongside the Honda Legend, sharing platforms and engineering resources. It was a lifeline, and some inside the company believed it might be the beginning of a real recovery. Then BMW stepped in. The German automaker purchased the Rover Group in 1994, which blindsided Honda and effectively ended the Japanese partnership overnight. BMW invested heavily trying to modernize the Cowley and Longbridge plants, but the losses were staggering. At one point, Rover was reportedly costing BMW more than £1 million per day. After 6 years, BMW concluded that the only thing worth keeping was the Mini brand and the Cowley factory in Oxford. In 2000, they sold the rest of the Rover group to a consortium of British businessmen called Phoenix for the symbolic price of £10. That purchase price tells you everything about how much confidence the market had left in British-owned car manufacturing. If you are finding this useful, consider subscribing. There is more automotive history coming every week, so here is where things get complicated. While British-owned car manufacturing was collapsing in the Midlands, a parallel industry was quietly being built on the other side of the country. In 1984, Nissan opened a factory in Sunderland. Toyota built a plant in Burniston, Derbyshire. Honda set up a production facility in Swindon. These Japanese manufacturers brought their own production methods, their own supply chains, and their own quality control systems. The workers on the factory floors in Sunderland were often the very same people who had built British Leyland cars a decade earlier. The difference was management philosophy, modern engineering standards, and a culture that treated manufacturing as a discipline rather than a tradition to be preserved at all costs. The Nissan plant in Sunderland became one of the most productive car factories anywhere in Europe. It eventually produced more vehicles per year than all of Italy's car plants combined. Perhaps most remarkably, the Sunderland factory exported Nissan vehicles back to Japan and sold them there, a genuine vote of confidence in British labor using Japanese methods. Could the same workers who had been dismissed as ungovernable under British Leyland really be among Europe's most efficient? The Sunderland production numbers answered that question clearly. However, none of this could save the last British-owned volume manufacturer. MG Rover, the company that Phoenix had bought for £10, stumbled through 5 years without launching a single genuinely new model. The Rover 75, a well-regarded executive sedan, was the newest thing in the lineup, and it had been designed entirely under BMW's watch before the split. By 2005, component suppliers were refusing to deliver parts to the Longbridge factory because they were not getting paid. The Rover 25 and MG ZR hatchbacks, still sitting on the assembly track, were built from parts designed in the late 1990s. The Japanese and German competition had moved on. MG Rover had not. The end came on April 8, 2005, when the company went into administration. The cars on the Longbridge production line that Friday afternoon were frozen mid-assembly, some missing engines, others waiting for trim panels that would never arrive. Workers left the factory gates not knowing if they would ever return. They did not. Over 6,000 direct jobs vanished overnight, and another 25,000 disappeared from the supply chain across the West Midlands. From seat manufacturers in Coventry to paint suppliers in Warwickshire to the pubs and shops that depended on factory wages. What became of the factory itself? The Chinese company Nanjing Automobile purchased the remaining assets 3 months later, acquiring the tooling, the intellectual property, and the lease on a factory that had once employed 25,000 workers during its peak in the late 1960s. Herbert Austin had founded the Longbridge plant almost exactly a century earlier. Its final chapter as a British-owned operation lasted just one Friday afternoon. The government spent approximately £146 million on support packages for the displaced workers and the shattered local economy. The pattern was unmistakable. Every time a British car company failed, the government would intervene just enough to delay the collapse, but never enough to fix the underlying problems. Then a foreign buyer would arrive, pick through the wreckage, and walk away with the brand name, the engineering blueprints, or both. Today, the roll call of once British car brands reads like a list of foreign acquisitions. Rolls-Royce belongs to BMW. Bentley belongs to Volkswagen. Jaguar and Land Rover belong to Tata Motors. MG belongs to the Chinese state-owned company SAIC. Lotus was purchased by Geely of Malaysia. Aston Martin's largest shareholders include a Saudi sovereign wealth fund and a Canadian billionaire. The famous names survive on the bonnets. The boardrooms are in Munich, Wolfsburg, Mumbai, and Shanghai. Is the story over? Not quite. In early 2025, BMW paused a £600 million investment to begin electric Mini production at the Oxford plant, citing uncertain demand for electric vehicles across Europe. The Oxford factory, which has operated since 1913 when William Morris built his first cars there, currently produces only combustion engine Minis. Those engines will be banned from sale in the UK before the end of the decade. Ford has cut 800 British jobs. The Vauxhall plant in Luton, another site with more than a century of continuous production, closed its doors for the final time. But it would be too simple to end the story there. 7 of the leading Formula One racing teams are headquartered in Britain, from Mercedes at Brackley to McLaren at Woking to Red Bull at Milton Keynes. The engineering talent that once built Jaguars and Minis now designs the fastest racing machines on the planet. McLaren builds road-going supercars in Surrey using carbon fiber techniques that would have seemed like science fiction to the workers on the Longbridge assembly line. Bentley, under Volkswagen's ownership, has turned Crewe into a center for luxury vehicle manufacturing that exports to over 60 countries. The Mini, reborn under BMW, became one of the best-selling premium small cars in the world before the current uncertainty over electrification. Over 900,000 cars rolled off British production lines in 2023. The difference is that the decisions about what gets built, where production happens, and for how long the factories remain open are now made in Munich, in Tokyo, in Mumbai, and in Beijing. The question worth sitting with is whether that distinction matters, whether a country can still call an industry its own when the nameplates remain on the bonnet, but the strategic decisions have moved to another continent, whether craftsmanship and engineering talent are enough when the capital and the long-term vision come from somewhere else entirely. Britain did not stop making good cars because its people forgot how to build them. It stopped because the system around those people, the ill-conceived mergers, the industrial unrest, the government interference, the chronic decades of underinvestment, could not hold together long enough for the talent to make a difference. The Jaguar E-Type is still considered one of the most beautiful machines ever designed. The original Mini still draws crowds at car shows from Goodwood to Pebble Beach. Somewhere in a Sunderland factory right now, a British worker is building a Nissan that will be shipped across the Pacific to Tokyo and sold there as a symbol of quality engineering. The irony of that would not be lost on the generation who built Austins at Longbridge and believed they were building the future. If you want to see how another country's car industry faced a similar reckoning, the video playing next covers that story. Subscribe so you do not miss it.